We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. I just want to say, as you all travel back to your communities, to just take a moment right now to take the sound of this room into your heart, the look of your comrades, something that you learned, some emotion that you had. And when it gets discouraging and seems absolutely impossible, bring back this moment right here, where you know that there were thousands and thousands of people who have worked with you over a lifetime to try to find what it means to be a peaceful person, what it means to be a person who works for justice, what it means to be someone who holds the weight of the horror and at the same time holds the weight of the spectacular beauty of what goes on this planet. And it is our job as conscientious people to be able to hold both parts and move forward with grace and dignity and courage, and you are a great example of that. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. Thank you.
Welcome. We are in the beginning now of one of the last webinars that's being organized by the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. There are many others. If you look, I will put on the chat the link that gets to them. This one is to focus on the last stage of the anti-war movement, the period from about the time of the peace agreement through the end of the war, and specifically to focus on the core organization of our work at that point, which was the Coalition to Stop Funding the War. A couple of housekeeping things. The chat is closed until we get to the discussion for you to talk to each other. You can contact any of the speakers, but to talk to each other, you need to wait until we get to the discussion point. The Q&A, you can post questions and we will try to get to them. We have a full program and we're trying to keep it within the 90-minute framework. The whole program will be on YouTube probably by tomorrow, and if it is, you'll get as a registrant, you'll get a note that will give you the link to watch it, rewatch it yourself, or to share it with other people. I'm going to put on the chat the page with the bios, which now includes a timeline of the legislation and what was going on amongst anti-war activists at that time. So, but that'll be there forever. So you don't have to look at it now, but you can go back to it after this is over. There will be at least one or two more programs before we call this a wrap. One of the members of the committee is working on a program about the anti-war movement in Europe. And I hope that we're going to do another program about the music of the anti-war movement. We may try to do one about people who went to Canada, but those pieces are not in place yet. And it's another possibility of one of legal people who worked with deserters, but we are coming to the end and wanting to get all of this. It'll be on YouTube for I don't know how long, but we also hope to have hard copies of everything in key university archives, though we are still having to raise the money to make that possible. So we're going to start out actually with another video, which is a long conversation with Jane Fonda that Brewster Rhoads had. And Jane's schedule is such she can be with us today, but I think you're going to get a rare treat with her most expansive on her role in the anti-war movement and the Indochina Peace Campaign, and then the coalition to stop funding the war. So here we go.
Wonderful to have you join us for this webinar on the Coalition to Stop Funding the War and the activities that occurred, especially in the last 2.5 years of the war, from January of 73 to April of 75. And you have played such a critical role with the national anti-war movement. And I think it would be great if we could start out with you just when laying the groundwork for what did you walk into when you started to get deeply involved in the fight against the war?
Yeah, thank you very much for wanting to talk about this, Brewster, because, I don't remember who it was that told me this in the early 70s, but they said, think of the Vietnam War as a stool with 3 legs. There's the Vietnamese themselves, there's world opinion, and there's the American anti-war movement. And so much of the reporting on the war and the ending of the war, including Ken Burns's documentary, leave out the American anti-war movement. So we're going to talk about that now. And I had the good fortune in 1972 to meet Tom Hayden. He eventually became my husband. Why was that fortunate? Because Tom he had a great strategic sense and a great sense of history. And so what he did for us was he realized that Watergate, which was a result of the Pentagon Papers, when Daniel Ellsberg took the papers from the Rand Corporation and gave them to the New York Times. Was it the Times or the Post? I can't remember now, but they were published. And what did they show? They showed that for decades, American administrations, Republican as well as Democratic, had sort of known that we couldn't win, but wouldn't say so, kept sending more and more people, guys, because in those days it was guys primarily that were fighting combat. According to his biography, I think President Johnson said at one point if I withdraw from Vietnam, Bobby Kennedy, who was running against him, will call me an unmanly man. So in other words, a lot of the foreign policy was governed by men's need to feel like they were real men, that we can't withdraw. Anyway, so Tom realized Nixon was president. This was 1970, early 71, early 72. Well, he'd been working on this for a while. The Pentagon trials were going on. Dan Ellsberg was on trial for treason. Nixon was wounded because of Watergate. He'd been involved in this attempt to get documents about Ellsberg that could smear him and make people disregard what he had done and think he was a bad person. And we had the Pentagon Papers that showed that all of these administrations had known that we probably couldn't win and had lied and had kept the war going. And so Tom Hayden realized this is the moment when we can do something that has not been done before with the American anti-war movement in the time of Vietnam. Because prior to this, the anti-war movement here had become violent. There were a lot of violent demonstrations. People had pulled away from the movement. And on top of that, Nixon was convincing a lot of Americans that he was ending the war. He was bringing home the ground troops. But he was escalating the war from the air with bombs that had been deemed illegal by international rules of law, cluster bombs and such. It was terrible what we were dropping on North Vietnam, but people didn't really pay that much attention. And what they saw was guys coming home. The war is ending. Richard Nixon was running for re-election. Oh, he's ending the war. So what we did, everybody cut their hair short. Everybody took away the beads and the braids and the sandals, started wearing suits and ties. We looked like average Americans, which basically a lot of us were. Certainly Tom Hayden was, came from Royal Oak, Michigan. And Tom created the Indochina Peace Campaign, which would be a group of us traveling across the country. We did 80 cities in 3 months. We started the tour at the Ohio State Fair in Dayton, Ohio, right in the heart of Middle America. There was Tom, there was me, there was the incredible singer Holly Near, there was an American POW who had been captured by the South Vietnamese, the NLF, what Americans call the Viet Cong. So he had been a prisoner in the South. George Smith was his name, is his name. He's still with us. And we had a French POW also. And we began to travel. And as we traveled, different people would join us. For example, a number of Vietnamese students in the United States joined us and talked about the tiger cages, these horrific cages built by Halliburton that American policy had created for Vietnam, where prisoners would be put in there. They couldn't stand up and they couldn't lie down. And it was torture, our tiger cages. So the Vietnamese kids would talk about what was going on there. Fred Bramfman, he had written an incredible book exposing for the first time that America had bombed the Plain of Jars in Laos and wiped out a civilization there. He was brilliant. And he created many, many pieces of literature for us, talking about the torture in the prisons, the tiger cages, how many people were dying on both sides, things that the average American didn't know about, showing that Nixon was not ending the war. He was still trying to bring Vietnam to its knees. Tens of thousands of pieces of literature we brought with us. And so off we went. We were speaking to Middle America, and they listened. Our message was, because you see, just probably people who are listening to this know this, but just in case people who aren't super knowledgeable about the war, I'm just going to say it. What had been going on was the United States government was funding a puppet government in South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, Thieu. We were propping up this government in order to protect our interests in South Vietnam. More and more American soldiers realized this was not a South Vietnamese government. Thieu was not a president that the Vietnamese wanted, respected, voted for. This was purely our imposition on South Vietnam. So more and more American soldiers were saying, we're not going to risk our lives for some American puppet when the Vietnamese people don't want this. And, by the time we launched the Indochina Peace Campaign and started touring this country, military historians have described American troops as on the verge of collapse. There were only 24,000 American troops on the ground in South Vietnam, and they were not in good shape. Drugs, resistance, refusal to go out, not because they were bad. All of the military historians admit that the troops that we fielded in Vietnam were among the best forces that any country had ever fielded. But this was a bad war, and the soldiers knew it. They knew it up close. And so they were refusing to fight, or they were doping themselves to numb the pain that they were feeling. I think it's important that we know this. What happened was not the fault of the soldiers. It was the fault of the policy. When you ask young men to fight a bad policy, they're eventually going to understand what's going on, and they're going to not want to do it. And that was kind of the situation. So there was the kind of almost collapse of the American military. Not the planes, not the bombs, not the pilots, but the ground troops. So it was incredible, our traveling. We'd have 5,000, 10,000 people. Sometimes the heads of the schools or wherever would say, oh, there's a bomb scare. And Tom and I and Holly, everybody, we would say, feel free to go. We're not going because we believe it's a hoax. Nobody would leave. And so it was hugely successful. They would sign up. We would ask them, the purpose was to get them to write their congressman and call their congressperson, cut the funding that is keeping this puppet regime going in South Vietnam. We knew that if the funding went, that the war would stop because this puppet government couldn't survive without our help. And so, Holly Near, as we went along, she wrote this song talking about what happened in each city where we went, talking about how she saw American people, average working people and housewives, saw them change. It was breathtaking. It was exhausting. We would go, like in the morning, we'd have editorial board meetings, then we'd go to union halls, then we'd have a rally at noon, and then we'd have a press conference. And in every city, we would meet with anti-war activists that were already there to talk about the new strategy, which is cutting aid to Thieu. That was the strategy. At a time when Nixon was weakened, and it was now clear that we had been lied to for decades. Tom very brilliantly could weave into his talk the Pentagon Papers, a lot of quoting from the Pentagon Papers. I had just come back from North Vietnam, which was a very controversial trip. So I was able to talk about the bombing of the dikes and what that meant. You know, the fact that the Red River Delta of North Vietnam is below sea level. This is where the food comes from to feed the North Vietnamese. And we were trying to weaken the earthen dikes built by the peasants with their hands. It wasn't, then they didn't have heavy equipment or concrete or anything like that. This was earth. And we were bombing the dikes in order to flood the Red River Delta, which in the Pentagon Papers revealed, Nixon said, I mean, Henry Kissinger said to Johnson, it could mean 2 million people die through starvation or whatever. And Johnson, to his credit, said, we can't do this. This is something that, you know, Hitler tried to do during the Second World War. America cannot be guilty of doing something like this, trying to drown these people and starve them. But Nixon, he did. He was bombing the dikes. And I went to try to bring back proof that this was happening. So there was that going on. And I was able to talk about that. And by the way, the bombing of the dikes stopped 2 months later. So at one point during this first national tour, 80-day tour, 3-month tour to 80 cities, maybe you know, Brewster, but I remember Larry Levin told us there was some congressman called the office in Washington where you all were working to say, stop, call your guys off. We're being inundated with calls and letters. You've got to stop this.
Well, there's no question. What you did with the tour got people to think, okay, I've been against the war for a long time, went to a lot of demonstrations over the years, but I get it now that there is a unique opportunity to focus our anger and pressure on members of Congress to get them to vote the right way to finally cut U.S. military support that's propping up the two regime and keeping the war going, right?
That's right. But I think what's important was the people we were talking to weren't like you. You know, they weren't people who've been protesting for a long time. These were middle America. These were the people that Johnson said when, I think was it Edward R. Murrow? Who was it that turned against the war? And he said, if I've lost Cronkite, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America.
Well, he certainly lost him. Yeah.
Yeah. These were not people who'd been protesters. This was middle America, and they started to really understand. That was why it was important. We looked like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. We didn't look radical.
Right.
And we were speaking to average people, and we got through to them.
So being at the coalition at the time, you did the first tour, actually the coalition got set up in January of 73 when IPC set up its office there in Santa Monica, kind of simultaneously. What we ended up being is the sort of the legislative arm of the anti-war movement that had, with your help, reached out to people who had not been involved up to that point in the war, but cared enough to say, yeah, I will write a letter. I will go on a delegation visit to my member of Congress. I will try to get my organization to pass a resolution in opposition because I'm done with it. And of course, public opinion, right, at the time was on our side, finally, had shifted entirely. So it was just about mobilizing the folks who already agreed with what we had to do and directing them to have influence where it made the biggest impact.
Yeah.
And I'd just be interested in knowing, like, you know, IPC played a key role with the coalition from 73 on, taking the information that we would develop under Larry's leadership and send it out to the grassroots. And then that was in turn spread to the people that you had reached out to and engaged in many cases for the first time. And you're right, it generated floods of letters and delegation visits and ultimately made the difference in votes that came up that were very, very close. So and you played a key role. I know you and Tom came to DC in January of 74 and spent 3 weeks doing legislative briefings for members and their staff, correct, about what was going on. And in many cases and Ron Dellums helped set up those seminar meeting rooms for you. and I understand you met with about 50 different members of Congress. And Mary McGrory, wrote about your visit and how you were the most unlikely but very impactful lobbyist on the war. I was
Well,
interested. Yeah.
the right wing demanded that we register as lobbyists. You remember that?
Ah, okay.
And of course, we weren't lobbyists, but yeah, I remember that.
Were there do you have any recollections of your interactions with members of Congress back in the day and what it
No,
was like? They were surprised to see you at their door, though, huh?
yes, I guess back then they were.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the tour 2 years in a row. And then finally Congress cut the aid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, Jane, just in closing here, you spend so much of your life standing up for what's right when it comes to the environment, women's rights, workers' rights, social and economic justice. And I'd just be interested to know what you are most proud of having accomplished in your work against the war.
I think I may have had a role in the ending of the bombing of the dikes, and I'm very proud of that.
Right.
And I'm really, really grateful to Tom for understanding this is the moment. This is when this is it. We have to take advantage of the weakening of the federal government because of the scandal of Watergate and the weakening of the justifications for the war because of the Pentagon Papers, which have now been revealed, to make a final move, not in the way it had happened before with protesting and things getting rowdy, but through dogged education of middle America about what was really happening, that the war was not ending, that it was escalating, and that the Vietnamese were being tortured and cheated by our government in our name with our tax dollars. That was a great thing. I had only been an activist for a year, but it was a huge and beautiful learning experience. It was wonderful.
Well, Jane, thank you for all you've done on so many things in your life that have affected so many people, but especially the role you played here.
One
We're
of the things that I
grateful.
learned is the
Yeah,
importance of understanding history.
yeah.
Yeah.
Needs to be taught more and better, right?
Yes. And another thing, because prior to meeting Tom and launching with him the Indochina Peace Campaign, I'd been part of the GI movement. And so it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the men and now women who get put in harm's way by our government are the ones who realize first that the war is wrong. The parallels with what's happening today are heartbreaking. You know, Robert McNamara was the architect of the Vietnam War, but he did something very unusual at the end of his life. He wrote a book in which he admitted that it was a mistake. He admitted that we never understood who the Vietnamese were. We didn't realize that they were Buddhists, not Catholics, which is what McNamara thought. It was a Catholic country, Buddhist country that had centuries, not decades, but centuries of experience fighting against would-be conquerors from the Mongols, Genghis Khan, Chinese, Japanese, the French, and they always won. They, in our American hubris, not enough time was spent figuring out who they were. And this is happening now in Iran. You know, Trump can't understand. Why are these people not giving up? Why have they not bowed down to us? He has no idea what he's gotten into. Will we never learn? One of the reasons that I wanted to join you and John McAuliff in this effort to pull together the history of the Vietnam War is because we have to understand our history and learn from it so we won't repeat it like we're doing right now. So it's thank you for including me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and sharing your perspective and experience, and uh, call out or shout out about the future here. We have to learn from the past.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much, Jane. It's wonderful to have you join us, and we're going to carry on the discussion in just a moment. So thank you.
So it was, I think, a very special moment that we've had now with Jane. We're now in the live program, and the first speaker will be Larry Levin, who was, for most of its existence, the director of the Coalition to Stop Funding the War. So brings that perspective to this history. Larry.
Well, thanks, John. That was really fascinating to hear Jane and hear her analysis of the whole situation. Am I okay now to continue?
Go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when Jane and Tom and IPC came to Washington, decided to focus on cutting off funding for the war and came to Washington, it sounds a little bit like a 1940s Hollywood movie when Mr. Smith came to Washington. But when they decided to do that, they found an existing network of individuals and groups that had already been working on this issue. The problem is it was quite a low energy effort, and it was quite an effort in the doldrums, to be perfectly honest. First of all, in the beginning of 1973, we were dealing with the peace candidate, George McGovern, being overwhelmingly defeated. We were dealing with the bombing of Hanoi that had happened, the Christmas bombing of Hanoi. We had dealing with the bombing of Cambodia. We were dealing with an anti-war movement of which the Mobilization Committee in Washington that had the major mobilization in Washington earlier to shut down the city didn't do that and basically just and the shootings at Kent State had happened just a few years earlier, which had a big effect on the peace movement. So when Tom and Jane and the Indochina Peace Campaign came to Washington, they found that kind of atmosphere. But they also found many of the organizations that had been working on the war had realized they needed to come together. They were multi-issue organizations, but they realized now that so much of their efforts to fight the war had to be united and had to be done because the war was continuing, was wrong. It was also hurting them tremendously, hurting their priorities because of the funding problems. So they came together and formed a coalition to stop funding the war. They included unions like the United Auto Workers, the electrical workers, the National Education Association. They included civic organizations like Common Cause, like Americans for Democratic Action, like Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And they included all of the mainstream religious organizations with offices in Washington. And this was all coordinated by two people, Ed Snyder of the Friends Committee on National Legislation and Dr. Dudley Ward of the Board of Churches Society of the United Methodist Church. They convened all these organizations. They formulated the idea of the coalition and they put it together. Dr. Ward of the Methodist Church supplied the office space in the Methodist Church's massive building directly across from the Supreme Court in Washington. And Ed Snyder of the Friends Committee arranged unlimited financing of the coalition from Stuart Mott, the son of the co-founder of General Motors, who earlier Stuart had been one of, if not the largest single financial contributor to the anti-war presidential campaigns of Eugene McCarthy in 1968 and George McGovern in 1972. So the coalition was formed, it was working, and it was more than just a do-gooder organization. It had high-powered political people like Ed Snyder and Dr. Ward, the head of the United Presbyterian Office in Washington, Josiah Beeman, who was a high official of the California Democratic Party and close to senior members of Congress. John Isaacs, experienced lobbyist of Americans for Democratic Action. And when the coalition was set up, it was intended to operate on three levels. The traditional level of Washington institutional deal-making and networking, including lobbying. A second level of research where analytical and high-quality information would be brought to Congress about what was wrong with the war and how it was hurting America, provided by Fred Brafman, the brilliant Fred Brafman of the Indochina Resource Center, Don Luce of the Indochina Mobile Education Project, and the firsthand accounts of the war from many people who had been there, including Jane Barton, David Barton, Diane and Michael, who you'll hear from later. And they provided the substance and the content. But the key to the coalition was the third element, and that was a disciplined and new way of dealing with grassroots organizing, a new way of building constituencies in the key congressional districts. It wasn't a matter of bundles of mail being sent in, although that didn't hurt. It wasn't a matter of just voting, although that didn't hurt. It wasn't a matter of just meeting with your congressperson, although that didn't hurt either. It was much more strategic and much more disciplined. It was understanding that while the decisions were being made in the halls of Congress, the levers of power were in the district. And that's what the coalition was focused on. And that's where all the money that Stuart Mott provided was directed towards. Now, what do I mean by while the political and policy decisions were being made in Washington, the levers of power were in the districts? Well, I mean that it was a different way of dealing with Congress. It was going to the sources of power of the representative in our key district. It was going to their golf clubs. It was going to their fundraisers. It was going to the churches they were part of. It was going to the Kiwanis Club. It was going to the bar and medical associations, which is why James talked about cutting our hair and taking off our beads, because you couldn't go to the golf club or the Kiwanis or the Bar and Medical Association with your long hair and your beads. I mean, we're being obviously a little cliched here. But it was doing that, and that's the way votes were influenced. Now, that's not to say there weren't cultural conflicts. There were always cultural conflicts in coming to an understanding between the existing organizations in the coalition and the Indochina Peace Campaign, the people coming off the streets, the people coming from the protest movement. I remember on one of the first key votes in the summer of 1973, when Congress voted 204 to 204 not to continue authorizing funding for U.S. military action in Indochina, which the Senate had gone ahead and done and needed a positive vote from the House of Representatives. And we stopped that on a tie vote. And we could even point out which Congress people we had been able to influence. And I can tell you how we influenced them. I mean, in the weeks before that, I had spoken as a result of local organizing and the people in the communities coming to me from the Indochina Peace Campaign, from the church groups, from the labor unions, telling me who the girlfriends of some of these congress people were, and how I could reach them, telling me who their golf buddies were, telling me who their fundraisers were, telling me who their church pastors, who the teachers of their young children were. I remember on that 204 to 204 vote, the weekend before, I think I talked to two girlfriends, one priest, and one teacher of the children of a congressperson, and all four of them agreed to talk to the member of Congress before the vote. And when we won the vote, it was an amazing thing. A lot of the members of the board of directors of the coalition were in the office, and one senior one as I mentioned, the political director of the United Methodist Church, I'm sorry, the United Presbyterian Church in Washington, the director of their office, tapped me on the shoulder and took me aside and said, I see you were talking to Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda on the phone about the vote, that they called to ask about it. And I said, yes, they've been helping. And he said to me, he said, well, be a little careful. Don't get too close to them. You know, they rub some Congress people the wrong way. This was even after we'd won the vote. But it just shows a little bit of the cultural conflict. And there was even more of this cultural conflict. I mean, I remember that summer, it was a little bit quieter. And after this big vote, people were reconsidering where to go next, on both sides. And on a hot summer day, I came into the office a Friday when nothing goes on in Congress, and I was wearing my shorts and t-shirt. And all of a sudden, I get a call from Ted Kennedy's office, the chief of staff. They need to see me immediately. I said, what could this be about? And I was kind of, impressed. Oh, they want to see me. I guess I'm important. I'm going to go see Ted Kennedy's office. And I go to the office, on this quiet Friday, hot afternoon, and I go into the senior political director's office, and he opens his desk drawer and pulls out a copy of the Indochina Peace Campaign's newsletter, Focal Point, that had just come out, which on the cover of it had a picture of a Vietnamese peasant woman in a concave, in one of her concave hats, pointing a rifle up at an American plane, trying to shoot it down, a gigantic picture on the front page of the IPC newsreel. And he began screaming at me saying, you expect us to win votes while your organization's people are trying to shoot down American planes? It's another example of the conflict. And as I was leaving, I said, I'll deal with it. I'll talk to them. And I started turning around to walk out of the office, clomp, clomp, clomp. And he said, and by the way, stop wearing those goddamn Ho Chi Minh sandals when you're in the Capitol. And I just happened to notice I was wearing my rubber-soled Ho Chi Minh sandals, walking, because it was a Friday and I didn't expect to be there. I guess it's not clump, 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 since they were made of rubber. They go squish, squish, squish. But, another one of the cultural conflicts. But it all worked out. I think everybody learned from each other. IPC gave a jolt of energy to the coalition. The coalition and Ed Snyder and Dudley Ward grew to appreciate Tom and Jane's influence with Congress and ability to open doors. And when I talk about this being a different way of dealing with Congress, a different way of community organizing, I want to just read to you a short statement from one anti-war senator who had no contact with us because we didn't need him. We didn't need to organize in his district anymore. We didn't need to have any role with him. We were focusing all our money, all our energy, all our work in the marginal districts. But an anti-war senator said, how short our memories are, how still our voices have become, how still are the peace rallies, gone are the sacks of mail, gone are the earnest college students walking up and down the halls of Congress. Maybe it's because the draft has ended. Maybe it's stupefying cynicism about the whole government process that has been incapable of responding. Maybe we are so emotionally drained, we no longer have the ability to care. That was his idea of what the peace movement had become. And we had a good little giggle about that. Because in fact, we felt the peace movement was stronger than ever, much more concentrated where it needed to be, and having a powerful effect. It wasn't doing the dramas he was asking for. It was being effective. And you'll hear some reports now from some of the other speakers about how these new policies were being implemented. That's it for me for now.
Thanks very much, Larry. One of the things about doing this program, as with other programs, is we discover how much we didn't know. And we're hoping that all of these programs will find amplification by a young graduate student doing her or his PhD thesis and going into pulling all these pieces together for a wider audience. We're going to turn to the local level, the organizing level, with two people, Karen Nussbaum and Brewster Rhoads. Again, their bios, I put on the chat the link for their bios if you've not read them already, but we'll give them the maximum time to talk. Karen, go ahead.
Thanks very much, John, and to this panel. I'm really delighted to be here. I was a local organizer in Boston, and we were not one of those places that Larry just identified as being where we needed to concentrate. What I want to do is talk a little bit about what that grassroots experience was that led up to the focus that was provided by the Coalition to Stop Funding the War. And then Brewster can talk more about what it really looked like on the ground to change those votes. So as Larry talked about, we'd had this massively active anti-war movement and we'd hit a wall. In 1969, we had the moratorium where 2 million people were on the streets, with about 500,000 in Washington, D.C. So we had that kind of organizing going on. And in 1970, on the other end, we had 32 bombings of federal buildings. So we had these two different directions, and nothing was working. We hit a wall. We didn't know what to do. At least that was the feeling among what was now a majority status anti-war sentiment in the country. In 1971, I remember this crystallizing for me when I went to the May Day demonstrations in Washington, D.C., which was much more guerrilla tactics and about 50,000 people, and 12,000 were arrested. 1 out of 4 of the demonstrators were arrested. I was in what we called the Jeanette Rankin Brigade of women from Boston, our little affinity group, and we were so good at evading the police that we didn't actually see much of the action. But as we often did in those days, the day after the action, you had an open strategy meeting. Anybody who wanted to come came to the meeting. There were hundreds of people who didn't represent organizations or have discipline or anything. And I could feel in the room at the time the organized anti-war movement dissolving as speaker after speaker rose to talk about a different fight that was more important and another fight or another direction that had to be pursued at the same time. When I came back to Boston, to the People's Coalition for Peace and Justice, we were flailing around and we came up with a slogan, "Education is action," which was pathetic, but also just represented that we had to find any path forward. And so we did. And here are a couple of examples of the things that we did. So I had a group of like 4 or 5 women, and every 3 or 4 weeks we would get together and draw little Lulu anti-war comic strips, which then we mimeoed and handed out on street corners. I started doing high school organizing. So I go to high schools, with a 50-mile radius of Boston and meet with these kids. Then we would do events in the evenings with their parents and, to just get anything kind of going again at the local level. The kind of brainier people in the People's Coalition for Peace and Justice wrote these turgid 4-page, 10-point font treatises on the history of Indochina. There were like 6 or 8 different versions of these, and print them up, great graphics, and we would hand them out on the street corners of Boston. Like, who read this stuff? Who knows? I don't know, but it kept us busy and active. There were puppeteers who I think came out of the American Friends Service Committee who every single Saturday, went out to the Boston Common with anti-war skits. And I was doing working women organizing at the time, and we had a big conference on working women, and it was about organizing working women, this new branch of the women's movement, and about ending the war in Vietnam. Now, today, if I would never do that again. That was bad organizing strategy, but it was part of, you tried to do anything. The Indochina Peace Campaign gave us attracted thousands of people anew. It gave us that kind of impulse that we needed. And the Coalition to Stop Funding the War gave us the strategic directive. And I want to just end with one short story. So in 1974, don't ask why, but I ended up in London and I was at a play. And in the audience of the play is the Republican Senator Jacob Javits. So during intermission, I go up to Jacob Javits, and he was anti-war, and so he was not a target of Larry's. But I go up to him and I say, "What are you doing to make sure that we're not funding the war in Vietnam?" And I knew it wasn't like I was going to change his vote, but I wanted him to feel that there was no escape, and that I wanted him to go back to Congress and tell his friends there's no escape. And I felt proud, not because what I did was exceptional, but because what I did was common at that point. As Larry said, there was no escape. We were in their congressional offices. We were in their district offices. We were in their churches. If they were in the grocery store, we talked to them in the grocery store. We were everywhere, and we were demanding that they stop funding the war, and they did. So Brewster can tell you how that actually worked out. What went into doing?
Great. I'm in here.
All right, John, want me to go? You're on mute, John.
Brewster is an active member of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee and helped design this whole program. So go ahead, Brewster.
Well, great, John. And thanks so much for all of you taking the time to listen in. And Karen, that was wonderful. Larry, you really laid it out so well. And it was wonderful, exciting to hear Jane's presentation as well. So I am somebody who benefited from everything that went on ahead of me. Karen actually recruited me by phone from Boston when I lived in Western Massachusetts back in early part of 1974. I was a student at Williams College and I participated in every doggone demonstration possible from 69 through that period of time, going to all kinds of places, doing what I thought was the best work to be done at the time. And like Karen, I felt frustrated that we weren't making the concrete progress that I felt we should have. And I'm going to share my screen a little bit to go through some of this stuff here, if I can. I got some slides that hopefully will make things a little more interesting. So, when you see your name in the New York Times, of course, it's not talking about me. It was Kingman Brewster. You got to figure out that somebody is telling you that you better get more involved, okay? And so here I was, just a college student with the long hair, of course, at the time. I was one of the youngest guys hanging around this work. But when the peace accords were officially signed on January 27th of 73, I was living with three other guys, one of whom was a Vietnam vet who lost his eyesight in the war. And we were all, of course, deeply anti-war and activists, but we decided we got to have a celebration of the end of this war. So we went to our local bar downstairs from where we lived, walked in there with a beanpole and an American flag, and there were four veterans who would be in there in wheelchairs every day just about playing pool. And I think it went into effect at 7 o'clock or so that night. And my veteran friend jumped up on the pool table, after somebody unplugged the jukebox and said, "Hey, I don't care whether you're for the war or against the war. Tonight, the war is over. And let's celebrate that it is done." We all knew that it wasn't done. But regardless, he said, "Let's go out, march up the street around the Civil War Monument in North Adams, Massachusetts, working class community, and have our own celebration." The snow was crazy. We walked out in the street with the four veterans in wheelchairs. One of them had the flag in their chair. And as soon as we started walking up the main street, blocking traffic, a police car comes around and the guy gets out and says, "What are you guys doing? This is crazy. What are you guys doing?" And of course, he was a vet and he knew the four guys in wheelchairs. And somebody explained what we were doing. He says, "Okay, guys, follow me." So we had a police escort up to the main street, through the business district, around the Civil War Monument, and came back into the bar. And as everybody got back in, my veteran friend got up on the pool table again and says, "We're going to have a moment of silence." And feel free, folks, to share as we do that the names of people who were your friends who died. It went on for 12 minutes. And it was one of the most powerful experiences I've had in my life, but it showed me, regardless of where you were in life, people could be united around an effort to promote peace. And so I got very involved in working around the political prisoner issue. So many of you recognize some of these images. I did a number of things like a Vigil for Peace with a whole great cross-section of folks. We got decent press coverage that helped to jack up pressure on a local congressman. I was fortunate enough to live in a district that's Silvio Conti, moderate Republican, the only Republican in the delegation from Massachusetts. And today he'd definitely be a Democrat. But he was very supportive of the work we were trying to get him to take leadership on as a Republican at the time, partnering with Democrats. And I was recruited by folks in D.C., actually Diane Jones, Michael's wife, after Karen got me involved in IPC, to be the regional organizer for the coalition in the summer of '74. So I traveled to 13 different congressional districts. We targeted 76, and I had 13 of them to go into those districts. And under the leadership of Ed Snyder, who is here, who is the basically the Secretary General of the Peace Movement, as the head of FCNL and the board chair for the organization for the coalition, we worked hard in those districts to do all the things that Larry talked about, dogging these candidates at every opportunity, going to their town hall meetings, we sent to all 13 of them, we sent them during the course of that summer. There were 4 of them had birthdays. We sent them flowers on their birthday from the peace community. I mean, whatever it took to ingratiate ourselves. But then I had an opportunity to move to DC. I got $125 a week after getting $50 a week as a regional organizer, but had the opportunity to work full-time on the staff. And we, as Larry described, we put out legislative bulletins every few weeks. And think about this. These were copied at an offset printing press. We had finally, at the end of this period, 6,000 people who were on our database, which started out at 700. And we would collate, staple, fold, and stuff, and put into envelopes after labeling them 6,000 pieces of mail once every 3 weeks. We had 22 people, 25 people, 3 cases of beer. That's what it took to get these legislative alerts out into the mail. It was a massive process, let me tell you. These are just some of the newsletters that we had. And we also, of course, tracked the voting that members of Congress did. Again, we targeted 30 senators and 76 members of Congress, and we helped people understand where their member of the House or Senate stood on issues. Now, this was our database. We didn't have computers. We literally had Xerox label masters. So you would take this master, stick it in a typewriter, type out the person's name and address, and file it under the state, theoretically, or congressional district in a file. So we had over 200 of these sheets of Xerox labels. That was our database. We all had Rolodexes, of course. I had 13, I think 12 states, New England and Middle Atlantic, that I was responsible for. We had others on the staff that Larry organized us to be regional liaisons to. So we lived on the phone. No cell phone, no computer, no email. The way we dealt with stuff was by phone and by mail. So Larry would get monthly bills that would be like 15 pages long, because each of these calls had a charge to them. Who would think today? But it might cost 50 cents or $1.25 to communicate with folks. But the exciting thing that I was able to participate in, again, completing the loop with my particular member of Congress. And again, I traveled throughout these districts, was on the phone regularly with the local contacts for the member organizations within the coalition, talking to them on a regular basis. He got to know who were the people who could really make things happen, who would then send in to me the names and addresses of another 20 people who ought to be added to our distribution list, so that those folks would get the alerts and would be mobilized as well. And that was mostly a significant number of people connected to, like, the social action chair of a local church, who had their own small group that they were the coordinator of. And when push came to shove, like when Silvio Conti agreed to sponsor, he did 3 major amendments as a Republican, okay, against his own Republican incumbent president. He agreed in January of, I guess in February of 75 to support legislation that basically stopped the administration's request for a supplemental allocation of funding for Vietnam and Cambodia. He said, the New York Times quoted him as saying, "My feet are in concrete, Mr. President. I'm not getting off of this effort to stop your extra funding. My feet are in concrete." So we got people throughout Western Massachusetts at the 5 College area around Smith, Holyoke, University of Massachusetts, Williams, North Adams State to send actually, these guys were sending a whole damn bag of concrete to them, but people would be sending a spoonful of concrete. We had tables set up at all kinds of places, and he got hundreds of envelopes. Think about it now. You open up an envelope and some quickcrete falls out onto the desks of these staff people, freaked them out. You couldn't get away with that today. But what it did was just drive home that, hey, we're on your side, Silvio Conti. Here's some more concrete to keep your feet in the concrete and not swerve off of your commitment. So the amazing thing is, like, I stay in touch with this guy. He sends me a doggone, I just found this today, a letter congratulating me on getting married to my wife, who I met, by the way, through the coalition. So, and to keep in mind that it was these bipartisan sponsorships that carried the day. Larry talked about how close some of those votes were. We needed to get members of the Republican Party to join with the activist Democrats who were leaders in this thing, and they brought so much weight to the table. So I can talk about other aspects of this work at some point, but that's enough for now. We can keep going on, and this was a great day. Okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to Michael.
Okay, Brewster, thank you very much. If you look on the BIOS page, the list of legislation was assembled by Brewster, and it's something worth going back and reminding yourself of if you were part of that campaign. So shifting over to, as Larry described, the dual contribution of someone who had direct experience in Vietnam, working with the Quakers with the American Friends Service Committee, and then was one of the first door knockers of the, we never were lobbyists, of course, but we were educators of members of Congress and their staffs, especially their staffs. Michael, unmute yourself, and Michael Jones is on now.
Thank you all for pulling this together, and also thank you for the wonderful work that we all did back then. We did good work, actually, and I think it's important for us to fully acknowledge that. I also think it would be fully appropriate for the country to acknowledge that it was completely wrong to do the Vietnam War, and we haven't had that acknowledgement at any official level that I'm aware of. And I think we'll continue to suffer until that happens and maybe kicks off some other recognitions of failed government. So Diane and I served with the American Friends Service Committee in Vietnam 70 through 72. And then after we were finished, the Service Committee asked us to go to Washington, D.C., and the coalition, so this was early 73, the coalition was just getting started, and share, and our role was to share our experiences. It turns out that there were members of Congress who were actually interested in information from people who had been there, who actually had real experience on the ground with people in Vietnam. And we were welcomed into several congressional offices under the auspices of the coalition. We would be given names of people in districts, and we would call them up and say, wouldn't you like to come and visit your Congress member? And we'll go with you, and we'll tell them what it's really like in America's war in Vietnam. And that actually worked quite a few times. And because the the Congress, for the first time since the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, all those 10 years, the Congress did absolutely nothing to challenge the war, question the war. All they did was rubber stamp the budget until the bombing of Cambodia happened. And finally, Congressman Adabo from New York brought forth an amendment to cut off the funding for the bombing of Cambodia. They couldn't cut off the bombing because they only had the control over the budget. So that's why it was the funding for the bombing of Cambodia. And enough work had been done to see, oh, these people are very likely to vote against the bombing of Cambodia. Thank them, but don't spend any time talking to them. These people are hopeless, forget them. But there were just a few right there in the middle, fence sitters, you might call them, or swing votes. And those were the people. That was the brilliance. I really do think that was the brilliance of the coalition, was to identify those people who were swing votes. It made we didn't have to lobby 400 Congress people. We only had to lobby about 20, or whether we lobbied or not, or educated, that's whatever. And so we found some receptivity in those people. I talked with Diane this morning. The only congressperson we actually remember was a liberal Republican from Pennsylvania. His name was Ed Beaster, and we both remembered him. And we talked to him a couple of times, and he was actually interested in what we had to say. And he voted again to cut off the bombing of Cambodia, along with enough colleagues to make it happen. And those, as Larry said earlier, there was one of the extremely important key vote. I thought it was the Adabo amendment. It turns out maybe my memory's a little fuzzy. It was that to keep them from overturning the Case Church amendment, which was kind of the Adabo amendment on the Senate side. But it came down to we knew the vote was really close, and a bunch of us went. We were there in the gallery in the House, and it came down, and they had this electronic chart up there, and as each member, it was a roll call vote as the votes came up, green lights and red lights, and we're all watching there. And when it came up, it was no kidding, it was a tie vote. And the way the structure of the legislation was that the tie vote went our way, and we jumped up in the gallery of the House and cheered, and bam, 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 the Speaker of the House, whoever that was, said order in the House, and so we became quiet after that. And after that, I had a chance to visit with Ed Snyder. People have told about Ed. To me, Ed's the hero, or one. Well, there were many heroes, but Ed is certainly one of the most magnificent. He had been with the Quaker lobby in Congress for decades, patiently advocating Native American rights, peace, any kind of humane and good policy. And I said to Ed, Ed, have you ever won a vote before? And he said, this is the first one. And he was so happy. He wasn't a real expressive fellow in my memory, but he had a beaming smile on his face the day that all of our efforts paid off in the tie vote, going the first vote really in Congress of any significance, in my understanding. You all know this history better than I do, to end the war, and we actually played a role, and it made a difference in all of those. But the background of the peace movement through all those other years where Congress was not part of the strategy because they absolved themselves of all responsibility by voting for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. So I just would like to share a little bit with what did Congress people hear when we went to see them? And the single event that came to my mind was the day when Diane and I first arrived in Vietnam, and we were actually in the Saigon office. The Quaker Project was in rehabilitation center making artificial arms and legs up in central Vietnam, Quang Ai province, where a lot of the worst fighting of the war happened. And when we first went into Quang Ai, we walked in the Quaker Rehab Center. It was a little cinder block building. And along one wall was a bench. And on that bench were about 20 people. And on the floor, in front of that bench were only about 8 or 10 legs. In other words, there should have been 40 legs for 20 people, but there were only less than half. And to see these people who had been wounded in their lives, nearly ended by the war that would not have been happening if it wasn't for our government. And those people they showed such strength and such camaraderie. And on the parallel bars was a young woman trying her amputated legs for the first time, and they were cheering her on. And that spirit of those people, incredibly tough, but incredibly devoted to the life and to their lives and to supporting one another, was totally inspirational for us as young Americans. For one thing, I mean, we already had our anti-war sentiments, but it told us that we had the right understanding, we were doing the right thing. And to be able to carry that kind of spirit from those people back to, of all places, Washington, D.C., and work with all of you folks and other wonderful people to try to get this country to do the right thing. It was really gratifying and an important moment in history as well as in our lives, I would say.
Thank you, Michael. The last speaker, you may recognize his face if you watched the Ken Burns series. What you're about to hear is the part that Ken left on the cutting room floor. Bill Zimmerman.
Thank you, John. Since I am the last speaker, I'm going to try to be very brief so we have ample time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to begin in the fall of 1974, when this effort was well underway. At that time, we were very excited about our work. To summarize, we were excited, I guess, because we finally had a strategy and a set of tactics that could actually have an impact directly on ending the war. And we had been quite successful by the fall of 74. To summarize the legislative work, which is pretty complex and dense, Nixon basically asked for $1.6 billion to fund the war in fiscal 74. And thanks to our lobbying and shifts in public opinion, we were able to cut that by about a third, down to $1.1 billion. But then he came back and asked for another $1.6 billion to fund fiscal 75. And that vote, the vote on that bill came to a head in August of 74, August 6th, actually, when the House voted to cut the $1.6 billion by more than 50%, down to $700 million. Nixon got the message. He had already been subject to a vote in the House Judiciary Committee to issue articles of impeachment. And on August 9th, 3 days after that vote in the House, Nixon officially resigned and we had a new president, Gerald Ford. That September, Ford went to the Senate and asked for more than the $700 million that the House had appropriated, and the Senate refused. So this was the most significant victory of the lobbying campaign up to that point. It was very good news for us, but it also came with potentially bad news because we knew that a cut of that size would have a major impact on the Army of South Vietnam, the ARVN, as it was called. It would mean that the ARVN would have less fuel, less ammunition, and in every way have a very diminished operational capacity. Given that, there was no doubt that the administration would come back and work very hard for additional aid. So we knew then that because they would come back and push hard for additional aid, that we would have to supercharge in some way our grassroots lobbying effort and put more pressure on the Congress to resist those requests. So in that context, a decision was made to host what came to be known as the Assembly to Save the Peace Accords. This decision was made in November, December 1974, and the idea was to gather grassroots lobbyists or educators, if you will, to Washington for an extensive training weekend over the January 25th and 6th, and then to turn those lobbyists loose in the Capitol on Monday, the following Monday, which was January 27th, the actual second anniversary of the signing of the Peace Accords that ended U.S. military participation in the war. The announcement went out that the Assembly to Save the Peace Accords would be held that weekend in January. And the announcement offered people who would come to Washington education and training through weekend seminars, but also new literature and assistance with housing and childcare for those people who were arriving from out of town. We anticipated when this invitation was issued that 200 to 400 people would come. 2,000 people registered. And of course, as we anticipated, Ford came back in early January and requested an emergency assistance of $300 million for the ARVN and $222 million for the military in Cambodia, a total of $522 million in direct military assistance. Meanwhile, as Congress was considering that, the staffs of the peace organizations and anti-war organizations in Washington who were pulling together this effort to create the Assembly to Save the Peace Agreements, that staff was overwhelmed because 2,000 registrants meant an enormous amount of logistical work, and there wasn't sufficient staff in Washington to do all of that. So Larry made a call to the Indochina Peace Campaign, where I was working in Santa Monica, and the staff there assigned me to go to Washington and assist with the organizing efforts. When I arrived, I met a situation of utter chaos. People were working all over town, recruiting speakers for the weekend, raising money, preparing literature, organizing press coverage. And as was pointed out before, no one had cell phones, the internet didn't exist, and communication and coordination for all these efforts was difficult. So one of the first things I did when I arrived, was to buy walkie-talkies for everybody. And that's how we communicated across the many offices in Washington where people were working. Now, the political response to the call for the Assembly was immense. Literally dozens and dozens of peace and anti-war organizations signed on to sponsor, as did leading activists like Ralph Abernathy, Daniel Ellsberg, William Sloane Coffin, and many others. Members of Congress joined as sponsors: Bella Abzug, Ron Dellums, Elizabeth Holtzman, to name a few. Journalists like I.F. Stone and Frankie Fitzgerald joined the effort. And bishops, rabbis, ministers, all participated, including the head of the National Council of Churches. Altogether, the sponsorship for the Assembly was probably the most unifying expression of anti-war support that had ever occurred. The Assembly itself began on Saturday morning. There were plenary sessions that laid out the history of the war, the current situation in Vietnam, provisions of the 1973 peace accords, and breakout sessions that drilled deeper down on those issues. Sunday, the plenaries and the breakout sessions were more narrowly focused on lobbying. Good technique, best arguments, lists of supporting facts, the need to be courteous to people with the opposing point of view. And there were also nuts and bolts sessions on Tuesday to help the grassroots lobbyists who had come to Washington to go beyond the usual grassroots lobbying techniques, constituent visits, letters, and phone calls to members and so forth, and to increase the pressure on the targeted members by also using newspaper ads, radio spots, billboards, ways of making their lobbying efforts more public issues that would put additional pressure on the targeted representatives and senators. Sunday evening, to end this weekend of seminars and education, we all adjourned to one of the local churches for a keynote address delivered by Senator George McGovern, the previous Democratic nominee for the presidency, and a concert by Holly Near and Joan Baez. The audience would not let Joan stop singing. The demand for encores went on for an inordinately long time. And so many people tried to attend that evening that I had to take Joan around to sing for small groups who had been turned away from the packed main auditorium where the concert had occurred. On Monday, thousands of people prowled the House of Congress, the halls of Congress. They made themselves visible by carrying signs and posters, and in between lobbying visits to specific members and senators, they passed out anti-war leaflets, offered information, and as that was going on, press coverage spread the word about what was happening beyond the confines of the buildings. After the assembly ended, many of the people who had come to Washington stayed on. And that was a good thing because the very next day, Ford reiterated his request for the $522 million in military aid, and our lobbying, which had been heightened by the experience of that weekend, was in position to massively organize opposition to that request. As that fight was playing out, 5 weeks after the assembly ended, the army of North Vietnam began to surround the provincial capital of Ban Mi Thuot. This was in the Central Highlands. It took them 1 day to take the city from 4,000 ARVN soldiers who had been defending it. This was one of the key battles of the war because at that point, the ARVN collapsed. Half of the 4,000 ARVN soldiers deserted, threw away their uniforms, pretended to be civilians, and joined a massive exodus down the roads leading south from that province. But it didn't stop at Ban Mi Thuot. The North Vietnamese army in the next 2 weeks took major cities in the northern section of South Vietnam, including Quang Tri, Hue, Da Nang. And after each victory, the ARVN collapsed even further, and the roads leading to Saigon were clogged even further with fleeing refugees and deserting ARVN soldiers. Ford continued to press for the additional aid, and as he did so, our lobbying effort continued, and it finally led to the last victory of the lobbying campaign when Congress refused the emergency request for $522 million. That was the most decisive victory in the campaign, and it only took a month longer because of the diminished capacity of the ARVN for the Army of North Vietnam to capture Saigon, drive tanks into the presidential palace, and successfully end their 30-year anti-colonial war for freedom and independence. That's it.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll have some questions.
Yeah, what we're gonna do, because we're running long, is I'm gonna say a couple of things substantively, and then I'm gonna open it up for discussion among the rest of you. The additional comments I wanted to say, as I said at the beginning, I mean, we're trying to recreate a history, and this depends on memories and whose archives are available or whose personal collections can be dug out of boxes in a timely way. And we've passed over an important part of this history, which is a conference that took place in Germantown, Ohio, where more than 20 organizations came together and created a united campaign, which had a variety of names. At one point, it was a united campaign for the peace agreement, and then it became the United Campaign for Peace in Indochina, and that piece of it was run out of the AFSC office in Philadelphia, where I was, and it provided a different framework for grassroots activism supplementing the coalition. Some of that'll show up on the bios page, and we may pick up more pieces of it. One of the other things that's notable is that we can't, for the life of us, remember where the assembly actually took place. It was originally scheduled for Mount Vernon College, and some of us think it was moved to Georgetown University for the overflow problem that Bill was talking about. So we will dig further into that history, and we will hope to, maybe somebody in the audience will have a more definitive memory, but it was an extraordinary event. The other tribute, we're always looking for independent confirmations of our impact. And we have one from the last US ambassador to South Vietnam, Graham Martin, who a year after our conference on January 27th, 1976, testified before Congress, and gave he was not accurate in all the facts. And of course, he had a political spin on it of his own. But I want to read a few sentences from what was in his testimony. He's referring to a congressional delegation. He says, just before this congressional visit, the president of the Senate of the Republic of Vietnam, Tran Van Lam, had visited Washington. The climate he found here and the incredible efficient propaganda exercise staged by the anti-Saigon lobby on the second anniversary of the 1973 Paris Accords led him to report to the government on his return to Saigon that they would not only not receive the restoration of the $300 million in military aid, but would receive no more military aid at all. A perceptive and accurate diagnosis we can now see of the realities in Washington in the early months of 1975. As this has presented, it's a reality not just due to what was going on in Washington, but what was going on all over the country in a very focused way. So it is now almost 90 minutes, and we still have 93 people joining us, but I do want to end it up in a few minutes, and I'm afraid we're not going to actually get to questions or chat. The chat is open if people want to comment to each other or comment to us. But does anybody have any final thoughts that they'd like to add in, what you didn't get to say the first time around, or what you have in response to what someone else said?
I do. I have one really brief comment that I want to make, because I think it's one of the few things that's, well, not few things, one of the things still relevant to our world today. In the Congress, on that tie vote, my memory, the numbers I don't have, but there were like 435 members of Congress, 35 of them are women, 200 of them are men. 90% of the women voted to cut off the bombing. Less than half of the men voted to cut off the bombing. And I just think that that's put together with what Jane quoted Johnson talking about being an unmanly man and the role of women, which was rising at that time in these important issues, I think is something that we really should be well aware of and take care of and celebrate.
Anybody else? Larry, do you?
No, it sounded like, I think everyone really gave an insightful and perceptive analysis of the area that they were speaking in, and it really left a comprehensive overview and understanding of what happened during this time.
Yeah, and Michael, I appreciate you pointing out Congressman Ed Beaster, who was my representative where I grew up in Philadelphia, small world. It's nice to see those Republicans come through so nicely.
Karen, do you have any final thoughts?
Just that how terribly important mainstream institutions were, especially the churches, in organizing and defeating the war in Vietnam, and that what a terrible lack that is in our efforts today, that we just are missing so many mainstream institutions to fight against authoritarianism here and militarism abroad.
I would say at the local level, from my experience with No Kings and reading what other people are doing and the way we've seen the resistance to ICE, that at the local level, religious people, churches have been tremendously important in anchoring this new round of protest. And I would suspect we'll see them if we continue with the war and expanding a war in Iran. I suspect that we will see them at both the local and national level. The other point, given your history, that ought to be mentioned is that the labor movement was very important, as Brewster and Larry said, in the coalition. And that is less obvious now, unfortunately. Bill, do you have any final?
Yeah. One of the lessons that can be drawn from this experience and applied today is the importance of integrating protest with action through government. We finally ended the war because we raised a powerful protest movement that finally found a way to directly impact government decisions through the lobbying campaign. As we protest the war in Iran and all the other outrageous things that Trump has done, we need to keep in mind that once again, protest is not enough. It needs to be combined with action that impact the government directly. And it is now April of an election year. And the direct impact we can all have is to work as hard as we possibly can on the midterm elections and create an outcome for those elections capable of altering what we're protesting against.
Thank you. I think that's a great conclusion. What I'm going to do, I should have mentioned that the person singing at the beginning was Holly Near, who both Jane and others have mentioned. And for those who didn't see that transition, I'm going to run it again because Holly is an extraordinary contributor to the spirit of what we were about. By tomorrow, I hope this will all be available to you and that you can share it far and wide. Thank everybody for a wonderful, wonderful contribution. And what I always forget to do, I never introduce myself. I'm John McAuliff, and I am the coordinator of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee and former staff member of the American Friends Service Committee, which is the core of there's a lot of AFSC echoes in the work of VPCC and the work we talk about. So end with Holly, and thank you again very much.
So much. Dr. Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone were assassinated in San Francisco, And then the song flew off around the world, and people keep adding verses. So we'll do a variety of verses, and people can grab microphones. And not you, you don't sing a microphone. And here we go. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are gentle, angry people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a land of many colors, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people. We are peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. I just want to say, as you all travel back to your communities, to just take a moment right now to take the sound of this room into your heart, the look of your comrades, something that you learned, some emotion that you had. And when it gets discouraging and seems absolutely impossible, bring back this moment right here where you know that there were thousands and thousands of people who have worked with you over a lifetime to try to find what it means to be a peaceful person, what it means to be a person who works for justice, what it means to be someone who holds the weight of the horror and at the same time holds the weight of the spectacular beauty of what goes on this planet. And it is our job as conscientious people to be able to hold both parts and move forward with grace and dignity and courage, and you are a great example of that. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a peaceful, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. Thank you all so much.
Wow, that's great.
So, oops, sorry. That was from the 2015 conference of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, that if you have several hours or days to watch it, the archive of that conference still has importance. And if I'm trying to get off, I'm not sure why I'm having trouble. At any rate, there we go. So thank you again very much. And this will be available. And I should also say that you will find a link when we send this out. If you like this program and you like the work that VPCC has done, none of it is at a expense, but we do have expenses, and your contributions would be very welcome.